So first of all, I'd like to thank Peter and Howard for bringing us together this way. I guess I now have to thank Google for bringing me here as well. Also, I'm honored to be here amongst the speakers that have been presenting. I've learned a great deal, and I'm eager to go home and share what I've learned with my students. I also want to thank those people who have been working behind the scenes to make this happen, in particular Brian in the back, who helped me with the PowerPoint presentation. And also, through the generosity of the two photographers who are here who talked to me at lunch about the craft that they're bringing to documenting this very, very important event. So my remarks will focus on an art education scholar who was the first I encountered who was committed to the relationship between art, education, and democracy, and the influence he had on aspects of my scholarship and as well as my teaching. Like several of the speakers who have spoken at this conference, I will speak to the alarming lack of knowledge of school-age students who have not been prepared to be active in the way we heard Howard describe within democracy. And much of my research is associated with doing field work in various sites. And so I will also conclude, based upon field work, by bringing your attention to a public school art teacher who Peter yesterday talked about, who embraces the awesome responsibility, and that's your quote from Peter, of preparing his students to engage in community and for the purpose of exercising their citizenship and as monitors of those who are in positions addressing issues such as those that they're concerned with. So in 1970, Professor Vincent Lanier of the University of Oregon published Art and the Disadvantaged. In this article, Lanier described the ways that photography, film, and video could be used by art educators to assist the so-called disadvantaged students in documenting the inequities and injustices influencing their lives. A curricular approach he described as filmmaking as social theorizing. Although Lanier used language that is archaic by today's standards, he persuasively argues against the term disadvantaged by recognizing that people are differently advantaged, including culturally. Lanier makes the case, radical at the time within the field of art education, that a noblesse oblige orientation to the education of children and youth is misguided in that such an approach ignores and diminishes the culture that all students and their families possess, regardless of socioeconomic measures. As an undergraduate studying art education in the early 1970s at Ohio University, Lanier's article was revelatory. Most art educators at that time were focused on art as creative expression and/or developing curricula around the academic disciplines such as art history, criticism, and aesthetics, with little or no reference to the sociocultural or socio-political contexts in which the arts are created, let alone the agency of students in contributing to their own education based on their lived experience. Soon after being introduced to Lanier's Art and the Disadvantaged, I discovered that this article was based on a 1969 article, The Teaching of Art as Social Revolution, published in the Phi Delta Kappan. In this earlier article, he wrote, and I quote, "The concept of art curriculum conceives of teaching of art as a deliberate, planned, and recognized vehicle for effecting social change. The intent is not to preach to young people how they are to behave in one and another context, but collectively to develop new ways of making our society operative and equitable." Lanier's scholarship, coupled with a still prevailing discipline-based focus on making and appreciate art, devoid of socio-political and cultural context, was a motivating factor for Kristen Congdon and I in initiating a book project in the early 1980s around the role of art in democracy. Published in 1987 by Teachers College Press, Art and Democracy brought together 14 authors contributing chapters addressing issues associated with culture, feminist perspectives, history, technology, the environment, and socially relevant curriculum, among others. My own chapter in this book discussed Lima, Ohio art educator Mike Huffman's work with high school students engaged in public dialogue about a proposed piece of public art by a sculptor from outside Lima. By them erecting a temporary piece of public art the students believed to be more representative of the community as they experienced it. Cupie pieced, and if you can imagine this is this again, temporary piece, large container of French fries with an enormous hamburger, coupled with them doing videotaped interviews of residents encountering this and asking these residents how they thought about what they were doing in relationship to what this public art was doing, was based in part on imagery derived from a local hamburger joint, it critiqued the process through which the original public art piece was chosen, as well as being a Claes Oldenburg-like counter to what students considered a nonsensical fantasy. Today, the field of art education broadly embraces the relationship between creating and appreciating art to curricular goals which respond to multiple cultures, social reconstruction, and social justice. Lanier's observations are no longer seen as radical, but as historical antecedents to what is being proposed by contemporary scholars in the field, as well as what is occurring in some classrooms today. This is fortunate because democracy is being significantly challenged and undermined by the globalist and I quote, the globalist, quote, populist storm, as we heard Asher Honiken refer to our situation earlier today. I throw this slide in. This is the allegory of bad government. It's a fresco in Siena. It was created as a warning to the citizens of Siena about making mistakes in how they were making decisions about Siena at the time. I think it's it resonates with me about what's currently happening in the United States, and I think if you look at the image, you can apply to those various characters whoever you want to be in the current US situation, but I definitely see our president there in the center. Within the United States, democracy is being assaulted by the executive branch in Congress and to some extent in the courts, and with support of a significant percent of our population. It should be a nonpartisan position that the current presidency is driving this assault. The present vulnerability of American democracy is due in part to a public education system that is not adequately preparing children and youth to participate in democracy. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, which periodically evaluates the knowledge of American school children, concluded in 2010, and this was the last year that they did the study across grades, that more than 2/3 of high school seniors scored below proficient in their knowledge of civics and government. The 2014 assessment of 8th graders found a similar result. The American Political Science Association Task Force on Civic Education in the 21st Century reports that it is axiomatic that current levels of political knowledge, political engagement, and political enthusiasm are so low as to threaten the vitality and stability of democratic politics in the United States. Philosopher John Dewey's Democracy in Education was published just over 100 years ago, and this book, like his other writings on educated, was motivated by a belief in democracy as the best type of government and out of concern that democracy was being eroded by social conditions at the time, which in many ways are like what we're experiencing today. Dewey's book describes democracy as a way of life, with schools preparing students to participate in democracy. Dewey believed that the future of democracy depends upon a broad and personalized educational experience. In his words, and I quote, "Education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform." Dewey believed that citizen participation in democracy is essential to the health and well-being, and that a goal of education should be an informed citizenry exercising their influence through voting. Now, while Dewey and Lanier and other progressive educators can continue to provide guidance, democracy as they experienced it in the late and early and mid-20th century has changed. Democracy can no longer be considered wholly dependent upon an informed citizens engaging in the electoral process. Our elected leadership is largely too beholden to moneyed interests, and that has been discussed here earlier as well. Within the United States, the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court ruling known as Citizens United has resulted in large sums of corporate money flowing to political candidates. Education generally, and art education specifically, must move beyond a late 19th, early 20th century experience and conception of democracy towards a democracy and citizenship consistent with present-day socio-political circumstances. Michael Shudson's 1998 The Good Citizen, A History of American Civic Life, and John Keene's The Life and Death of Democracy provide a way forward. Keene's position is that democracy is still being made, but that beginning in the 1940s, democracy moved from second-stage representative democracy towards a new form of democracy characterized by the multiplication and dispersal of diverse power monitoring and power-contested mechanisms. Monitory democracy, according to Keene, means, and I quote, the ongoing public scrutiny and public control of decision makers, whether they operate in the field of government or intergovernment institutions or within non-government civil society organizations, examples being NGOs, think tanks, watchdog groups, and professional associations, among others, end quote. Michael Shudson, on The Monitory Citizen, argues that citizenship has moved beyond voting to include public scrutiny as a part of the political dynamic and active participation in groups like those mentioned previously. Certainly the work of Aube Giroux and Rachel Percent that we experienced yesterday epitomized this monitory, at least in my opinion, epitomized this monitory democratic work. Now, what does this new form of citizenship mean for educating children and youth, and for those of us committed to preparing them for monitory democracy through the arts? Artists are at the forefront. We can certainly look to the work of artists, for they are often at the forefront of aligning the politics of public scrutiny within the United States and elsewhere. Consider these recent examples. There's Enrique Chu's work on the border between the United States and Mexico, where he has brought together 4,000 volunteers who assisted him in creating murals on the border wall between Mexico and the United States. Quoting Chu, his purpose is to spread the message of peace to people crossing the border by car or on foot, and are intended to be a final glimpse of hope for migrants risking danger as they cross northward. Jim Nanomi's work, much of Jim Nanomi's work portrays the racial violence that's unleashed on protesters at Standing Rock from the perspective of an indigenous artist. Nan Golden and Prescription Addiction Intervention brings attention to addiction, the opiate crisis, corporate interests behind it, and the cultural institutions that are benefiting. Dear Travelers is a zine that's being distributed by the Democracy Now! Protesters at Hong Kong Airport. And Rapper Face is protesting the lack of free speech in Russia. Within the context of art and education, I now return to the public school art education I mentioned earlier. Following my encounter with Huffman and his students in 1986, Huffman continued to work within the Lima schools as an art teacher and supervisor of the arts curriculum. Over the course of his 35 years with the district, leading to his retirement in 2014, Huffman continued to engage his students in art and civic engagement projects. This included engaging the school district with Americans for the Arts Animating Democracy Project, a project dedicated to creative social change. He also enlisted assistance from Lima's Allen County, Ohio's Common Threads volunteer organization with its mission to advance civic dialogue. Now, over the course of Huffman's career, the population of Lima experienced a steady decline from approximately 48,000 to 38,000 residents. The most recent district review by the Ohio Department of Education documents a distressed school system experiencing declining enrollment from approximately 44,000 students to 3,500 students. Overall, the population within the schools has shifted from a predominantly white population to what were once minorities, African Americans, Latinx, and multiracial, to those being the majority population. And this statistic is astounding. Enrollment by the subgroup of economically disadvantaged students within the district is now at almost 100%. In the report, the district received an F for its 4-year graduation rate and a D for the 5-year rate. Now, despite working within seriously resource-challenged and distressed district, Huffman from 1989 to 1992 initiated Project Democracy, resulting in grades 1 through 12 cross-disciplinary curriculum guides in promoting civic engagement through the arts. From 1996 to 97, he engaged his students in the Shelter Project, in which students placed 14 miniature houses around Lima. Through image and text on these houses, Huffman students brought attention to homelessness in their community. And this project required students to work through city government to obtain approval for the installations. From 2011 to 2014, Lima High School students addressed questions and experiences associated with racism, prejudice, tolerance, and acceptance. Students created a multimedia installation in ArtSpace Lima for the purpose of provoking viewers to consider multiple types of diversity, gender, religious, ethnic, racial, culture, through oral histories, video interviews with students, and posters representing these interviews. The installation was converted to a theatrical presentation that traveled to local schools and colleges. The 2006 Shrines to Local Schools is exemplary of Huffman's work with students. Significant to a student's educational experience are the buildings in which instruction occurs. Schools are often a source of civic pride, and if historic, a marker of how that pride has evolved over time. They are also a multi-generational chronicle of a community's history, both positive, but also the challenges that may be faced within those communities over time. Historic buildings are particularly important because of the way that they embody the ways that a community changes over time. And in this regard, schools contribute to what Kingston Heath, a historic preservationist, refers to as, quote, the patina of place or cultural weathering. Lima, Ohio lost much of its patina when its local school board, in response to the Ohio School Facilities Commission Rebuild Ohio program, demolished 12 school buildings erected between the early 20th century to the period just after World War II. Given that the district is now made up of 9 schools, the significance and the history lost through the demolition of this number of schools is profound. Huffman, along with 12 art teachers in the district and students in grades 3 through 12, confronted this loss and considering the following questions. How does a community deal with the sense of loss associated with the disappearance of neighborhood schools? What happens to communities associated with public spaces that are demolished? And where do those communities go? How can art educators and students work together within community to document cultural weathering and assist city planners and policymakers sustain community hubs? And how can art education curricula encourage art educators and students working within coalitions to prevent the demolition of historic places and neighborhoods? 4,600 students walked the sites where these 12 buildings once stood, collected oral histories from the former students of these schools, and examined artifacts such as yearbooks and memorabilia. Students also considered the concept of memorialization through the study of Greek and Etruscan column memorials, as well as the shrines that are placed along the roadside where fatal automobile accidents occurs. From this research, the Shrine for Lost Schools project emerged. Using 8 inches by 12 feet sonotubes, 13-column shrines were erected over a 4-week period throughout Lima. Students used a variety of materials and strategies in their memorials, and memorials were both representational and conceptual. One memorial was covered with shoes representing the presence of those who walked through the school over the course of its history. Another was covered with material that mirrored the faces of those encountering it, and another with the signs and symbols associated with particular buildings. Notes, flowers, and memorabilia marked visits to the shrines by the public. Visitors were invited to write thoughts and memories on the surface of the columns. Later, the columns were exhibited in ArtSpace Lima and on the evening that the exhibit opened, visitors were invited to record their memories of the schools that were described. Together, this group of Lima, Ohio residents representing multiple generations willingly embraced difficult issues associated with the politics of preservation, the economics of development, differences between history and memory, and who is able to contribute to historical narratives. The question of what students remember about schooling became very real to the teachers. Students learned from longtime residents what is remembered in the space of a lifetime. Together, students and teachers assisted the residents of Lima with the grief experienced when public schools are demolished, as well as the ways in which important places that are no longer in existence continue to shape thought, emotion, and action. In the work of Huffman and his students, that art education can attend to the role of arts in strengthening and maintaining democracy and civil society. Students can accept responsibility for developing, strengthening, and studying partnerships and collaborations among schools, the arts sector, and other appropriate civic organizations. Our curricula addresses the relationship of civil society to the individual, family, community, government, and business, and encourages students to understand and appreciate the relationship between culture, art, democracy, and citizenship. And then to conclude, I want to leave you with this quote by Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, which has been central to my teaching and scholarship since the beginning of my career. Freire says that education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participation in the transformation of their world. Thank you.